Hi. What do you see? When I asked Max about it, he saw scribbling. When I asked David, he also said scribbling. This is just an illustration of how when we see things, we tend to see the negative. We tend to see what's out of place or the mistake in something, the error, the negative. And I must admit, I've always been leaning towards seeing the negative of things, not the positive. This is something, if you're aware of it, can help you so that when you are looking at, say, the testimony of people's lives, the bios of people's lives, that you don't just focus on the negatives, but you see the good in their lives as well. Do we question the integrity of people simply because we don't agree with something or we don't share the same point of view as them? Or do we try to understand? Do we try and understand them? Are we open-minded when we look at the faith journeys of different people? We have been reading some of the mini bios of Victor Shepard's book, So Great a Cloud of Witnesses. And so we're going to continue with the bio of Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546. This is what Victor Shepard has to say. In my opinion, Isaac Watts is the finest English hymn writer, although many would cast their vote for Charles Wesley. Thomas Cranmer, the best liturgist, William Tyndale, the most perceptive Bible translator, Hugh Latimer, the finest preacher, and the Westminster Divines, the ablest catechists. Imagine all these gifted people gathered up into one individual, Luther. What it took a dozen Englishmen 200 years to do, Martin Luther did in 20. Born in Eisleben, Germany, in 1483, Luther quickly distinguished himself academically and appeared headed for a career in law. His family was shocked when he announced he was entering a monastery. As part of his preparation for becoming a monk, he made a pilgrimage to Rome, walking all the way there and back. Returning to Germany, he completed his studies for his doctoral degree and was hired as professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Nevertheless, he remained haunted by one matter for which his learning provided no help. How does a sinner get right with an all-holy God? The abstract guessing games of much medieval theology only increased his frustration. Luther sought the answer in the confessional. Time after time he confessed his sins, until those hearing his confession grew weary. He was much too severe with himself, they thought, too much given to dwelling on minor matters, upsetting himself unnecessarily. But in fact, Luther was not just worrying about trivial matters, and he was certainly not neurotic. He simply knew that God is not to be trifled with, that sin is undeniable and judgment inescapable. It was the spiritual director of the monastery, John Staupitz, who finally shed some light on Luther's perplexity. Look at the wounds of Christ, he was advised again and again, for there you will find a full and sufficient pardon. And then it happened. When he was reading Paul's epistle to Romans, he stumbled on a text which rang with the profoundest truth and which continues to echo in the hearts of God's people everywhere. The just shall live by faith, Romans 1:17. Through his fine grasp, through his fine appreciation of Hebrew and Greek grammar, as well as his growing grasp of the gospel of Paul, I'm going to have to reread that one. Through his fine appreciation of Hebrew and Greek grammar, as well as his growing grasp of the gospel that Paul is describing, he caught the force of God's justice or righteousness. Both English words translate the same Greek word. God's righteousness, he discovered, is not courtroom-type justice, which gives people exactly what they deserve. No comfort for troubled sinners here. God's righteousness, rather, means that God justifies, put in the right with himself, those who cling in faith to Christ crucified, the provision God has made for us through his sheer mercy. The just shall live by faith. Luther realized meant that when we abandon any pretense of self-justification before God on the grounds of self-righteousness, we become rightly related to God through simply trusting his provision for us and entrusting ourselves to him. It was and is impossible to exaggerate the cruciality of this gospel truth. It meant that as often as earnest people looked within themselves and stood aghast at the ravages of sin there, they also knew themselves pardoned in the provision God had made for them in the cross. To say the same thing differently, since faith for Paul was keeping company with Jesus Christ, as often as sinful people wondered about their status before God, they now realized that when God looked upon them, he saw them included in that Son, with whom he is ever well pleased. The relief was indescribable. To know that the just, justified, live by faith, said Luther, is to be the freest person alive. In 1520 he wrote a delightful pamphlet on Christian liberty. In it he maintains that Christians are gloriously freed from their self-preoccupations. Christians do not live in themselves. They live in Christ through faith and in their neighbors through love. Christians are taken out of themselves, directed toward their Lord and toward those whom their Lord has given them to serve. The result? Christians are free from anxious self-concern and free for a self-forgetful service of their fellow sufferers. From 1521 until his death in 1546, a reward was promised anyone who slew Luther. He remained undeterred. He was asked where he would be if the worst happened. That is, if he and everything he stood for were trampled and destroyed. His reply? I shall be then where I am now, in the hands of God. I'm going to link 2 videos that we did. They were Fran's videos from his book, In Search of Christian Freedom. The first one is Job and J.W. Integrity Keepers. Would not the faithful and discreet slave disfellowship Job for apostasy? And the second one, are ex-JWs still slaves to J.W. Org's Babylon interpretation?